Have you ever looked at a love so perfect it seemed to shimmer, and wondered what dark secrets might lie beneath that flawless surface? What happens when the fear of losing that perfection becomes an obsession? When jealousy, not with a fiery rage, but with a chilling, creeping cold, begins to seep into the cracks of a happy home. It's a cold that doesn't just numb the heart, but freezes it, turning love into something brittle, something that can be shattered into a million irreparable pieces. We are about to descend into such a story, a tale of how a creeping frost of jealousy led to a horrific act of violence, hidden behind the placid mask of everyday life. Before we pull back the curtain on this chilling drama, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the gripping tales we have in store for you. Now settle in and let us begin. The first time Clara felt the cold tendril of true jealousy wrap around her heart, it was not during a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation. It was on a Tuesday, a perfectly ordinary, sun-drenched Tuesday in early September, the kind of day that seemed manufactured for a postcard of suburban bliss. She was in her kitchen, a gleaming expanse of white marble and stainless steel that was her pride and joy, the centerpiece of the home she and Arthur had built together. The air was fragrant with the scent of lemon and thyme from the roast chicken she was preparing for their dinner. Through the large bay window, she could see Arthur in the garden, his back to her, talking on his phone. He was laughing. It was a sound as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, a rich, easy baritone that had first captivated her a decade ago at a crowded university fundraiser. But this laugh was different. It wasn't the gentle, shared chuckle he gave her when she said something witty, nor the booming laugh he reserved for his father's terrible jokes. This was lighter, more unguarded, a sound tinged with an intimacy that felt exclusive. He was leaning against the old oak tree, one hand tucked into the pocket of his tailored trousers, his head tilted at an angle she had seen 1,000 times. But today, framed by the window, he looked like a stranger in his own garden, sharing a secret world with the disembodied voice on the other end of the line. She told herself it was ridiculous. Arthur had a right to laugh with his friends, his colleagues, his sister. He was a partner at one of the city's most prestigious architectural firms. His days were a whirlwind of calls and collaborations. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling, as sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass in her shoe. The jealousy didn't announce itself with a roar. It whispered. Who is he talking to? Why that laugh for them and not for you? Clara moved away from the window, her hands suddenly unsteady as she basted the chicken. She had always been prone to a certain level of anxiety, a quiet fear of losing the things she held dear. Her childhood had been one of transient affections, a mother who loved her fiercely but erratically, and a father who was a loving but mostly absent figure. Her stability had been self-made, a fortress built brick by brick through academic achievement, a successful career in art curation, and finally Arthur. He wasn't just her husband. He was her anchor, the steady, unwavering center of her carefully constructed world. Their life was a masterpiece she had curated with meticulous care. The perfect house, the perfect careers, the perfect marriage, the envy of their friends, a testament to her success. The thought of a crack in its facade was unbearable. Later that evening, as they sat at their polished mahogany dining table, the chicken golden and succulent between them, she asked, her voice a carefully calibrated instrument of casual curiosity. Who were you on the phone with for so long this afternoon? You seem to be having a good time. Arthur looked up from his plate, a flicker of surprise in his blue eyes. Oh, that? Just Elena Vance, the new project lead on the waterfront development. She's brilliant, a bit of a firecracker. We were brainstorming a solution to a zoning issue. She has the most wonderfully absurd ideas that somehow end up being genius. He smiled, a reminiscent, private little smile that did not go unnoticed. Honestly, she's a lifesaver. Elena Vance. The name was new, and Clara filed it away in the cold, dark archive of her mind where she kept things that might one day prove to be a threat. I don't think you've mentioned her before, she said, her knife making a faint scratching sound against the porcelain plate. Didn't I? She just transferred from the Chicago office last month. You'll meet her at the firm's autumn gala. I think you'd like her. He took a bite of chicken. This is delicious, by the way. You've outdone yourself. His praise, which usually filled her with a warm glow, felt hollow. It was a perfunctory compliment, a line delivered while his thoughts were clearly elsewhere, perhaps still lingering on the wonderfully absurd ideas of the firecracker from Chicago. For the rest of the meal, she feigned interest in his day, nodding and smiling, but her mind was a maelstrom. She pictured this Elena Vance. Sharp, witty, ambitious. The kind of woman who didn't spend her afternoons roasting chickens, but rather solving zoning issues and sharing unguarded laughs with other people's husbands. The whispers of jealousy grew louder in the following weeks. Elena Vance became a recurring character in Arthur's daily recaps. Elena came up with a brilliant workaround for the structural supports. I had lunch with Elena to go over the schematics. Elena was telling the funniest story about her time in Chicago. Each mention was a small pinprick to Clara's soul. She began to engage in a form of masochistic self-torture, searching for Elena Vance online. The woman who stared back from the screen of her laptop was everything Clara had feared. She was younger, not by much, but by enough to matter. She had a sharp, intelligent face, a confident smile, and an impressive portfolio of award-winning buildings. Her profile on the firm's website described her as dynamic and innovative. Clara, who had put her own promising career on hold to become a part-time consultant so she could focus on building their life, felt a familiar, bitter pang of inadequacy. Her surveillance escalated. Started small. When Arthur was in the shower, she would quickly scroll through his call log. The name Elena Vance appeared with increasing frequency. There were texts too, mostly professional, filled with architectural jargon she didn't understand, but they were punctuated with friendly emojis and late-night timestamps that made her stomach clench. Great idea today. You're a lifesaver. Smiley face. Still at the office? Me too. This project is a beast. Tired face. One night, she found a thread that was undeniably personal. Elena just saw the most ridiculous rom-com. Now I can't sleep. Arthur. Let me guess, the one where the architect falls for the quirky journalist who hates his new building? Elena. The very one. It was painfully bad. You owe me for that recommendation. Arthur. I'll make it up to you. Coffee tomorrow? My treat. Elena. It's a date. Winky face. It's a date. The words burned on the screen. The winking emoji felt like a personal attack, a secret signal of a shared world from which Clara was excluded. She felt a wave of nausea. She closed the phone, her hands trembling, and placed it back on the nightstand exactly as she had found it. She lay in bed, her back to a sleeping Arthur, and stared into the darkness. The foundation of her perfect world had just cracked. The change in Clara was subtle at first, a slight cooling of her affections, a new sharpness in her tone. She stopped asking about his day, feigning headaches or fatigue when he tried to initiate conversation. She started making passive-aggressive comments. You must be so exhausted, working so many late nights, she'd say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I hope this new project is worth all the time you're spending away from home. Arthur, wrapped up in the pressures of the waterfront development, was slow to notice. He attributed her moodiness to stress. Is everything all right, honey? He'd ask, and she would assure him she was fine, just tired. But she wasn't fine. She was living in a state of high alert. Every notification on his phone, every unexplained delay in his commute home, a potential confirmation of her deepest fears. Her jealousy began to demand evidence, tangible proof she could hold in her hands. She started going through his pockets when he was asleep, checking his credit card statements online, searching for restaurant bills for two, hotel bookings, any sign of a secret life. She found nothing, but the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. It only proved, in her twisted logic, that he was being careful, that he was a skilled liar. The autumn gala, the event where she was supposed to finally meet her rival, loomed in her mind like a day of judgment. She spent weeks preparing, choosing a dress as stunning, backless gown of deep crimson silk that was designed to make her unforgettable. She would be the perfect wife on his arm, a vision of elegance and devotion that this other woman could not possibly compete with. She would reclaim her territory. The night of the gala was a symphony of clinking champagne glasses, polite laughter, and the low hum of influential people making connections. Clara was a flawless performer. She smiled. She mingled. She laughed at the right jokes, all the while scanning the room for a woman who matched the photo she had memorized. And then she saw her. Elena Vance was standing in a small circle with Arthur and some of his senior partners. She was not, Clara noted with a vicious satisfaction, a conventional beauty. She was tall and slender with a cascade of unruly dark hair and an animated way of speaking, her hands punctuating her words. But her eyes, even from across the room, were captivating, bright, intelligent, and fixed on Arthur with an intensity that made Clara's blood run cold. Arthur saw Clara approaching and his face lit up. "Ah, here she is. Everyone, I'd like you to meet my wife, Clara." He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her into the circle. "Clara, this is Elena Vance. I've been telling you so much about her." Clara extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile a brittle mask. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Elena. I've heard that so much." Elena's handshake was firm, her smile genuine and warm. "The pleasure is all mine. Arthur is a genius. I'm incredibly lucky to be working with him." The conversation flowed around them, a blur of shop talk and industry gossip. Clara stood silently, a beautiful statue at her husband's side, observing every glance, every shared smile between Arthur and Elena. They had an easy, familiar rapport, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at inside jokes. They were a team, and Clara was an outsider. The crimson dress suddenly felt garish, her smile grotesque. She was a prop in a play where she was no longer the leading lady. On the car ride home, the silence was thick with unspoken accusations. Clara stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of angry color. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. "You were very quiet tonight. Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice clipped. "You don't seem fine. You barely said 2 words to Elena. I thought you'd like her." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Like her? Why would I like the woman you're so obviously infatuated with?" Arthur stared at her, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "What are you talking about? Infatuated? Clara, she's my colleague." "Oh, please, Arthur. Don't insult my intelligence. The way you look at her, the way you laugh with her, that little private world you two have. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" The argument escalated into the most vicious fight of their marriage. Voices were raised, accusations hurled. Clara, in a frenzy of jealousy, threw the contents of his phone records at him, the late-night texts, the coffee date. Every instance a dagger she twisted with glee. Arthur was stunned, then furious. "You've been going through my phone? My private messages? Clara, that's insane. There is nothing going on between me and Elena. She's a friend, a colleague. Is our marriage so weak that you can't handle me having a female friend?" "This isn't about friendship," she shrieked, her carefully controlled facade finally shattering. "This is about respect. You've been emotionally cheating on me for months. Right under my nose, in our home. That's not true and you know it," he shouted back, his face flushed with anger. "I can't believe this. I can't live like this, walking on eggshells, being monitored like a criminal. Maybe I need some space. Maybe we both do." He grabbed his car keys from the counter and stormed out of the house, the front door slamming shut with a sound that echoed the breaking of something essential within Clara. She stood, trembling, in the silent house. He had never walked out on her before. "He's gone to her," the voice in her head whispered. "He's chosen her." The next day, Arthur returned. He was apologetic, calm. He explained that he had stayed at his brother's house to cool off. He insisted, with an earnestness that almost broke through her wall of suspicion, that she was the only woman he loved, that he was sorry for being oblivious to her feelings, and that he would be more mindful. He suggested they go to counseling, that they work through this. For a few weeks, a fragile truce settled over the house. Arthur was more attentive. He came home earlier, called her during the day, and made a point of not mentioning Elena's name. But for Clara it was too late. The trust was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He was just being more careful now, covering his tracks. The jealousy had taken root, and it was a hardy, tenacious weed that could not be easily pulled. It was twisting itself around her heart, squeezing the life and warmth out of it, leaving behind something cold, heavy, and dangerous. The final, irrevocable snap came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. Arthur had told her he was going to a site visit an hour out of town and would be home late. It was a plausible story, but Clara's mind, now a finely tuned instrument of suspicion, saw deceit in every detail. She had installed a tracking app on his phone a week prior, a transgression that, in her mind, was justified by his betrayal. She opened the app on her tablet, her heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. The app showed his car. It wasn't at the construction site. It was parked on a quiet, tree-lined street in a residential neighborhood she didn't recognize. She zoomed in, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the street name. It was from a piece of mail she had seen on Elena Vance's desk at the gala, a brief glimpse she had committed to memory. He was at Elena's house. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The rain lashing against the windows sounded like mocking laughter. Every promise he had made, every reassuring word, was a lie. He had lied to her face, left his loving wife at home, and driven to be with her. The pain was so immense, so blinding, that it transcended emotion and became something else entirely. It was a moment of terrible, crystalline clarity. The jealousy was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a demand for action. It told her that the thing she loved most had been corrupted, and the only way to purify it, the only way to stop the unbearable pain, was to excise the source. She went to her laptop, her fingers moving with a strange, detached calm. She opened a new browser window. Her search history, filled with signs of a cheating husband and Elena Vance architect, was now joined by new, more sinister queries. How to get away with murder. Odorless, untraceable poisons. Best tools for dismembering a human body. As she read, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. But inside the beautiful house, a cold, meticulous plan was beginning to form in the mind of a woman whose love had finally, irrevocably, frozen over. The masterpiece of her life had been defaced, and she, its curator, would now restore it, no matter the cost. The woman who greeted Arthur at the door that evening was not the same one he had left that morning. On the surface, she was identical. She wore his favorite cashmere sweater. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her smile was warm and welcoming. But her eyes, the deep brown pools he had once described as his anchor, held a new, chilling placidity. They were like the surface of a frozen lake, betraying nothing of the dark, cold depths beneath. "You're home," she said, her voice smooth as silk. She took his wet coat, her fingers brushing against his. "You must be frozen. Let me get you a drink. A hot toddy, perhaps." Arthur, weary from a long day and relieved by her placid demeanor, readily agreed. The tension that had been a constant, unwelcome resident in their home for weeks seemed to have finally evaporated. He sank into his favorite leather armchair by the fireplace, a grateful sigh escaping his lips. That sounds perfect. It was a brutal day. The rain was relentless. He didn't mention that the site visit had been canceled at the last minute, or that he had spent the afternoon at Elena's, but not for the reasons Clara imagined. Elena's father had passed away suddenly, and Arthur, along with 2 other colleagues, had gone to her home to offer condolences and help with the grim logistics of funeral arrangements. It was an act of collegial kindness, a fact he had intended to share with Clara, but seeing her so calm, he decided not to mention Elena's name and risk shattering the fragile peace. It was a fatal miscalculation. Clara moved around the kitchen with a preternatural grace. Every action was deliberate, precise. She simmered water, cinnamon, and cloves on the stove, the spicy aroma filling the air with a mockery of warmth and comfort. She squeezed a lemon, her grip steady. Then, she reached into the back of the pantry, behind a row of canned goods, for a small, unlabeled vial she had received in the mail 2 days earlier, the result of a discreet online purchase from a chemical supply website, paid for with a prepaid gift card. Inside the vial was a clear, viscous liquid, ethylene glycol, antifreeze, odorless, with a deceptively sweet taste, easily masked in a spiced, sugary drink. A few tablespoons would be enough. The website she had consulted described the symptoms in cold, clinical detail. Initial euphoria and intoxication, followed by nausea, and then, hours later, catastrophic kidney failure and cardiac arrest. It would look, to the untrained eye, like a sudden, tragic medical event. Natural causes. She measured 2 tablespoons into Arthur's favorite mug, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. She added a generous splash of dark rum, the hot spiced water, and a slice of lemon. She stirred it gently, the silver spoon making no sound against the ceramic. As she carried the mug into the living room, she felt nothing. No fear, no remorse, no hesitation. The jealousy had burned away all her other emotions, leaving behind only a cold, clear sense of purpose. She was not a murderer. She was a restorer. She was removing a stain. "Here you are, my love," she said, placing the steaming mug in his hands. He took a deep sip, his eyes closing in contentment. "This is exactly what I needed. You're a miracle worker." He smiled at her, a genuine, loving smile. "I'm sorry about the last few weeks, Clara. I've been an idiot. I promise. I'm going to make it up to you." "I know you will," she replied, her voice a soft murmur. She sat on the ottoman at his feet, watching him drink. She watched him drain the entire mug, her placid mask never slipping. They talked for nearly an hour. She guided the conversation, keeping it light, reminiscing about their first apartment, a trip they took to Italy, the day they brought home their golden retriever, Apollo, as a puppy. She was weaving a tapestry of their shared history, a final, beautiful shroud for the man she was about to erase. Arthur, lulled by the warm drink and the seemingly restored harmony, spoke freely, his voice growing slightly slurred, his movements becoming more languid. He attributed it to the rum and his exhaustion. "I'm feeling really sleepy," he said finally, his head lolling back against the chair. "Think I'll head up to bed." "Of course, darling," Clara said, helping him to his feet. He was unsteady, leaning on her heavily as they climbed the stairs. He collapsed onto the bed and was asleep almost instantly. Clara stood over him for a long moment, studying his face. The face she had loved with a desperate, all-consuming passion. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a profound and terrifying emptiness. He was no longer her husband. He was a problem that had been solved. She waited. For the next 2 hours, she sat in a chair in the corner of their bedroom, a silent, patient vigilante, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as it grew more shallow, more ragged. The first signs began as the websites had described. He moaned in his sleep, his body twitching. A wave of nausea caused him to vomit onto the floor. Clara cleaned it up calmly, her movements efficient, wiping the floor with disinfectant wipes until it gleamed. She was not disgusted. She was merely cleaning a mess. As the hours crept by, his condition worsened. His breathing became a series of strained, painful gasps. His heart, struggling against the poison coursing through his veins, began to beat in a frantic, irregular pattern. Around 3 in the morning, after a final, violent convulsion, he fell still. The ragged gasp ceased. The frantic heartbeat faded into silence. Clara placed 2 fingers on his neck, feeling for a pulse. There was nothing. She checked again, pressing harder. Still nothing. Arthur was gone. The second phase of her plan began immediately. There was no time for grief or hesitation. There was only the task at hand. She went to the garage. The night before, she had laid out her tools on a plastic tarp with the same care she would use to arrange a cheese board for a dinner party. A reciprocating saw with a new, sharp blade designed for cutting through wood and metal. A set of heavy-duty butcher knives she had ordered online. Thick rubber gloves, a plastic apron, safety goggles, and several rolls of heavy-duty contractor bags. She dragged Arthur's body from the bed. It was a dead weight, heavy and awkward. Getting him down the stairs was the most difficult part. She laid him on the plastic tarp in the center of the garage, the harsh fluorescent lights erasing all the shadows, turning the scene into a sterile, clinical tableau. What followed was a task of grim, mechanical butchery. Clara worked with a detached focus, a chilling efficiency born of meticulous research and a complete emotional disconnect. She was not hacking at the body of the man she had loved. She was disassembling a complex piece of machinery that was no longer functional. She followed the instructions she had memorized from a grisly medical diagram found on a dark corner of the internet. She made precise cuts at the joints, the knees, the elbows, the neck. The reciprocating saw whined, its sharp teeth biting through bone with a sickening, grinding sound. The air grew thick with the coppery smell of blood. She worked through the night, never once flinching, never once faltering. Each piece was carefully double-bagged in the thick black plastic, the air pressed out, the tops sealed with duct tape. When she was done, the garage floor was a scene of unimaginable horror, but she saw it only as a workspace that needed to be cleaned. The cleanup was as methodical as the act that preceded it. She gathered the soiled tarp, her apron, her gloves, and bagged them separately. She used buckets of bleach and water, scrubbing every inch of the concrete floor, then the walls, then the tools themselves, until no visible trace of what had happened remained. She knew, from her research, that even the most thorough cleaning could leave microscopic traces detectable by forensic science. So she moved to the final, crucial step. After showering and scrubbing every inch of her own body, she dressed in old painting clothes. She retrieved several cans of thick, gray epoxy sealant from a storage cabinet. Over the next few hours, she applied a new, fresh coat of sealant to the entire garage floor, paying special attention to the area where the tarp had been. It was a plausible home improvement project, one they had talked about doing for years. The new floor would permanently entomb any microscopic evidence she might have missed. It was a layer of pristine, unblemished gray over a foundation of absolute horror. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Clara was finishing her work. The sealed bags, 9 in total, were neatly stacked in the back of her SUV. The garage smelled not of blood, but of fresh paint and chemicals. The house was silent. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at her gleaming kitchen counter. She looked around at her perfect home, pristine and quiet. The stain had been removed. The masterpiece was hers again, whole and unsullied. She had a long day ahead. She had to dispose of the bags, an act that would require several trips to different dumpsters and remote wooded areas across the county. And then, the most important part of her plan, the performance of a lifetime, would begin. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze falling on the landline phone on the wall. In approximately 12 hours, she would pick up that receiver. Her voice would be trembling, thick with manufactured panic and fear. She would dial 911, and she would tell them that her husband, Arthur, hadn't come home last night. She would tell them she was worried something terrible had happened to him. The call to 911 was a masterclass in controlled hysteria. Clara's voice cracked at precisely the right moments. Her breathing was shallow and frantic, and she managed to convey a sense of a woman on the absolute brink of collapse. She explained that Arthur had gone to a site meeting the day before, that he'd called to say he would be late, but he had never come home. She had been calling his phone all night, but it went straight to voicemail. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she sobbed to the dispatcher. The picture of a wife who still believed in protocol and politeness even in the face of terror. "I'm sure he's fine. Maybe his car broke down somewhere with no service, but it's just not like him. It's not like him at all." When the first 2 uniformed officers arrived at her doorstep, they were met by a woman who looked utterly ravaged by worry. Her eyes were red-rimmed, a trick accomplished with a slice of onion held to her eyes moments before they arrived. Her face was pale, and she clutched a silk robe around herself as if it were a life raft. She led them into her immaculate home, offering them coffee as she recounted her story, her hands trembling as she gestured. "She seems genuinely terrified," the younger officer remarked to his partner as they left. "Poor woman. Hopefully, he just had a bit too much to drink with his buddies and is sleeping it off somewhere." The performance continued as the day wore on. She called Arthur's office, her voice laced with panic, to ask if they had heard from him. She spoke with his partners, who confirmed the site visit had been rained out. She called his brother, his parents, and their closest friends, each call a new layer in her carefully constructed reality of the distraught, abandoned wife. Her friends rallied around her, bringing casseroles and offering tearful hugs, none of them seeing the icy calm that lay just beneath her flawless portrayal of grief. Clara absorbed their sympathy like a sponge, using their concern to bolster her own credibility. The case was assigned to Detective Miles Corbin, a 20-year veteran with a weary face and eyes that missed nothing. He had seen hundreds of grieving spouses in his time, and he had developed a keen, almost psychic sense for when the grief was real and when it was a performance. When he first met Clara Williams, his internal alarm, faint but persistent, began to chime. She was perfect, too perfect. Her story was seamless, her emotions were textbook. She cried, but her mascara didn't run. She looked exhausted, but her house was spotless, unusually so, for a home in the midst of a crisis. And then there was the garage. "We'll need to take a look around the entire property, Mrs. Williams," Corbin said, his voice gentle but firm. "Standard procedure." "Of course, Detective. Anything you need," she said, wringing her hands. When Corbin and his partner opened the door to the garage, they were hit by the overwhelming smell of fresh epoxy. The floor was a uniform, glossy gray, looking as if it had been poured that very morning. "You've just had the floor redone?" Corbin asked, his eyes scanning the space. Clara gave a small, sad sigh. "It's silly, really. Arthur and I had been planning to do it for ages. With him gone last night, I couldn't sleep. I just needed to do something to keep my hands busy. I started it in the middle of the night. I suppose I wasn't thinking straight." It was a plausible explanation, one that painted her as a frantic, grieving woman seeking distraction. But to Corbin, it felt wrong. Who undertakes a major home improvement project in the middle of a personal crisis? It wasn't distraction. It was concealment. He made a mental note. The initial days of the investigation turned up nothing. Arthur's car was found abandoned in a supermarket parking lot 10 miles from his office, wiped clean of any fingerprints. His wallet and phone were missing. The prevailing theory was a carjacking gone wrong. Clara was treated as a tragic victim, her face gracing the local news, pleading for her husband's safe return. But Detective Corbin couldn't shake his unease. He started digging deeper into the perfect marriage of Clara and Arthur Williams. He interviewed friends, family, and colleagues. A picture began to emerge, not of the idyllic union Clara described, but of a relationship under strain. Friends recounted Clara's increasing possessiveness. Colleagues spoke of Arthur's easygoing, flirtatious nature and mentioned his close working relationship with a new architect, Elena Vance. The interview with Elena was telling. She was professional and composed, but clearly shaken by Arthur's disappearance. She spoke of him with genuine warmth and respect. "Was your relationship with Mr. Williams purely professional?" Corbin asked, his gaze steady. Elena didn't flinch. "Yes, Arthur was my colleague and my friend. He spoke about his wife constantly. He adored her." She hesitated, then added, "But he did mention that she could be intensely jealous." Corbin's team pulled the couple's financial records and phone logs. They found the purchase of the butcher knives and the reciprocating saw from an online hardware store a week before Arthur vanished. When Corbin asked her about it, Clara had a ready answer. "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Arthur was planning to take down that old, half-dead oak tree in the backyard. He wanted the right tools for the job. It was a good lie, plausible and quick. But the lies were beginning to pile up, forming a web of deceit that was growing increasingly fragile. The cracks began to show. A neighbor's security camera, which Clara had forgotten, captured footage of her SUV leaving her driveway at 4 in the morning on the night Arthur disappeared, and returning an hour later. It then showed her leaving 2 more times before sunrise, each trip lasting about an hour. It was inconsistent with her story of being home all night, paralyzed by worry. When confronted with the footage, Clara's composure faltered for the first time. I couldn't breathe," she stammered, her eyes wide. "I felt like the walls were closing in. I just had to drive. I didn't go anywhere in particular, just drove around." Corbin didn't believe her for a second. He put a tracking warrant on her vehicle and had forensics teams do a sweep of the SUV. They found nothing. She had cleaned it as meticulously as she had cleaned the garage. The breakthrough came from the most mundane of sources, the municipal waste department. Acting on Corbin's hunch that Clara had disposed of something, a team of investigators began the grim, painstaking task of searching the contents of every commercial dumpster and landfill site along the routes she might have taken on her pre-dawn drives. For a week, they found nothing but garbage. But then, in a landfill 40 miles north of the city, a worker sorting through construction debris found a black contractor bag that felt unusually heavy. Inside, double-bagged and sealed with duct tape, was a human torso. Over the next few hours, in different sections of the landfill, 8 more bags were found. Dental records confirmed the victim was Arthur Williams. The news broke, and Clara's performance of the grieving widow escalated into a heart-wrenching portrayal of a woman shattered by tragedy. She collapsed into the arms of a friend when Detective Corbin delivered the news, her wails of anguish echoing through the perfect house. But Corbin's eyes were cold. He was no longer looking at a victim. He was looking at his prime suspect. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in the forensics lab. The new epoxy floor in the garage was a barrier, but it wasn't perfect. The powerful chemicals in the sealant had reacted with the concrete, and in doing so had created microscopic air bubbles. Trapped within one of those infinitesimal bubbles, near the drain in the center of the floor, was a single microscopic droplet of blood that had seeped into the porous concrete before the sealant was applied. It was too small to be seen by the naked eye, but it was there, and the DNA was a perfect match for Arthur Williams. Detective Corbin and his team arrived at Clara's house with a search warrant and a forensics unit. They didn't need to tear up the floor. Using a special drill, they took a core sample from the concrete directly beneath the drain. They arrested Clara that afternoon. She was arranging flowers in her living room, a picture of serene widowhood. As they read her rights and placed her in handcuffs, her perfect mask finally crumbled. But there was no screaming, no denial, no tears. Her face went utterly blank, her eyes as empty and cold as a winter sky. The performance was over. Her confession was delivered in a quiet, sterile interrogation room. She spoke in a calm, flat monotone, recounting the events with a chilling lack of emotion, as if she were describing a recipe she had followed. She detailed the poison, the dismemberment, the cleaning, the disposal of the body parts. She spared no detail, her voice never wavering. "Why did you do it?" Corbin asked, his voice raw with a mixture of revulsion and disbelief. Clara looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of something in her empty eyes. It wasn't remorse. It was something that looked almost like pride. "He ruined the painting," she said softly. "Our life was a perfect piece of art. My masterpiece. He was careless with it. He allowed a smudge, a flaw. I was just restoring it. I was cleaning the canvas. It had to be perfect again." The trial was a media sensation. The story of the beautiful, cold-blooded, suburban butcher, captivating a horrified public. She was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The last time the public saw her, she was being led from the courtroom in a gray prison jumpsuit, her face a placid, unreadable mask. The perfect house was sold, its gleaming kitchen and polished floors passed on to a new family, ignorant of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. In her prison cell, Clara lived a life of quiet, orderly routine. She made her bed with military precision. She kept her small space immaculately clean. She never spoke of Arthur, never showed a single sign of regret. She had, in her own twisted way, achieved her goal. She had excised the flaw, erased the stain. Her world was once again under her complete control. It was a smaller world, a world of gray concrete and steel bars, but it was perfect. A gilded cage of her own making, pristine and silent, with no one left to smudge the canvas, and nothing left to lose.